All right, welcome back to Leadership Talks. I have guests today. Hi, guests.
Hi, BJ.
Hi, these are my colleagues, Sarah and Krista from ADVISA. You get to meet some of the team. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a second. Actually, let's do it right now. So why don't we start with Sarah? Who are you and who are you at ADVISA? And then just pass the baton.
Great. Well, hello, I'm Sarah Kolczak. I'm a leadership and organization development specialist at ADVISA, which just is a long, fancy title to say that I'm on our client solutions team, help deliver our engagement and really our diagnose and define products to clients. Outside of work, can I share a little?
Yeah, heck yeah, let's do it.
Okay, great. So outside of work, I'm a 200-hour certified yoga teacher. And so that is where my big passion for wellness is born from. And so we'll get to talk about that a little bit today too.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Krista.
Krista Warren, ditto to Sarah in terms of title. I have been with ADVISA for roughly 2 years on the same team as well, Client Solutions. And so my background is in industrial organizational psychology, which again, another mouthful here, but it's really, I'm a big geek on psychology, people, humans, and how we can take science and psychology and then apply that to the workplace to make work be a place we all want to be and love to be at.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I, BJ, was a track coach. So we're going to be listening to them today more than me, but we're going to ask some questions. So in all seriousness, if you're listening to this, where to nest what we're going to be talking about today is, hey, we have to get employee experience data. We have to get employee engagement data, and it's important that we gather data. And it's now what? Like, what do I do with this practice to turn it into something that can be actualized into real change? So I can really change my culture. And I'm fortunate enough to work with Sarah and Krista on several occasions on exactly that with our client companies. So I thought bringing that to the forefront for all those that are listening that are clients of mine, that are predictive index clients, that actually currently do engagement with us, it might be a great way to ask them new questions and get some different insight that you might otherwise not get when we're together. And for anyone else listening that's not a client of ADVISA's or mine, it's an opportunity to like think through whatever you're doing with this data. What might I do? What could be if I'm considering these things? What are some lookouts? So over the next like 30 minutes or so, hopefully we tag on some of those bases. So are you ready for the first question?
Ready as I'll ever be.
I'm ready, Mr. Jennings. All right, here we go. So first question is, so why should a team gather employee experience data? If I weren't doing it before, why? Either one of you, I'd open to hear your feedback.
I think the most important thing with collecting employee experience data, employee listening, whatever the terminology is that you're using, is that you want to get that objective pulse on how are employees feeling in the workplace. And you can have conversations, but one person's experience might not represent the whole. So it's an easy way to capture what is the aggregate experience of our employees. Are there areas where we're doing really well? Because you also want to celebrate that. But then what are some areas where we can move that needle and make improvements for our employees at work?
So I have my leadership team. Like we get it. We have a good sense. We talk to a couple people.
Yeah.
Like we feel like we have a good sense of things. Like we have a great culture here. So what you're saying is I might be operating, if I say that, I might be operating in my own little bubble.
Right.
Where I'm like, oh, I think things are pretty good, and maybe they're not be. So gathering a bigger data set is going to give me more reality.
Yeah.
To work from.
Exactly.
All right.
The reality is we show up with our own lens and view our experience, and it's natural to assume that our experience is others' experience.
Right. Thanks, Krista. What would you add to that?
Yeah, I think it's also a good way to find new directions of where you want to go. And so, I mean, we've worked with organizations that are going through like big times of change, and you want to gather some feedback on how that change is feeling across the organization. Because again, you have that perception maybe at the leadership levels that can look different at other levels and kind of give you that direction of, hey, I didn't know that was an issue over there for this department, for these people. How can we maybe dig into that a little bit more and take a new strategic direction if that needs to happen?
Right. I like that. And I think, when you think about why, I think there's some leadership teams where there's weak leaders. And if you're afraid to test assumptions that you have about your perception of the workforce, that can happen. Like early stage leaders in a company might not be the right leaders. and I might feel like I get exposed, and then I could be embarrassed, and I don't want to do like, there's, I think, practical reasons why some leaders might not want to get this data. And if you're listening and you're like, oh my gosh, I know a leader just like that. I mean, let's have some compassion for that person. For a period of time, they're there because they had a productive role to play. And then sometimes, and if you've ever been there, maybe I outgrew my role. Maybe there's development that I didn't get at a period of time. And then a big gap happened and I was assumed to have to know these things because I'm this title and what have you. So if you're on one of those leadership teams and you're listening, or if you work for one of those leadership teams, just understand if they don't want to, maybe consider like, what are some of the themes behind that prevent you from getting this data in whatever your role is. All right. Anything else on this one before we move on? All right, cool. I kind of led into this. When is it a bad idea to run a survey?
Well, I can start with just the idea of if you've previously run a survey and you've not taken any action from the last survey, the last thing you want to do is collect more data from people. They're going to start to feel as if their input and feedback isn't valued and not being acted upon. So that's really the best practices. Don't launch another one until you've taken visible, tangible action that folks have seen and felt.
Excellent. I like it.
Yeah.
Sarah?
I would say bad idea to run a survey if your executive leadership team is not on board. If you don't have that buy-in at the very top level, then it's going to be really hard to create that change. And that's really the goal of an engagement survey. Like Krista mentioned, you don't want to run another one until you've had some change happen and you're acting on the feedback. And it's really hard to be able to act on that feedback if you don't have that buy-in from the top level.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, I mean, how do we feel about running a survey when we haven't even clearly communicated what our strategy is? We don't have a strategy. We might not have a really galvanized mission, vision, or values. Like we don't really have a direction. Like what are we benchmarking?
Yeah.
It's just feelings in general with the relative like rudderless way that we do things in a way. And but I know I'm speaking a little hyperbole here, but oftentimes we started making money doing one thing and companies just kind of morph on their own momentum into things, and it's not as intentional as maybe the employee body thinks it was. If you think about like organizations that don't have it. So I might even add, it might be a bad idea to run a survey if you have no form of business strategy. It doesn't have to be a formal strategic plan, but something communicated. Here's why we do what we do. Here's why we're here. And it's intelligible. Now there's something for employees to react to as to like, who are we? What are we? And then that's kind of the balance. And then people can react to it versus just democratizing. What should we be? There's a lot of danger in that because how many employees do you have? 1,000. Guess how many ideas you're going to have about what you should be? Probably 1,000. What do you do? Like back to Sarah's point, what do I do with that? Well, it could be this and we should sort of, we get a committee on that. It's like, oh goodness, you all need to do the jobs of leaders first. Then per what Sarah says, get behind this after the fact. At some point when you've rolled it out or done something, you can do that. But yeah, per Krista, if you've done one before something, taken no action, you already have your survey. So no use wasting your time. And to Sarah's point, yeah, if you're going to run it without the leadership team and you expect them to make decisions with it, brace for disappointment.
Yeah, I would also add, you said like to have something for the people to react to with your strategy. I would also say that gives them an opportunity to feel connected to something too, because your employees want to give their feedback because they care. They care about the purpose and what your organization is doing. And so when you give them the opportunity to not only react, but also feel connected to that mission, vision, values, whatever it is, then that gives even more opportunity for them to give actual feedback because they're caring. They're to take the time to give that feedback.
I like it. And I think, I mean, when I look at feedback that I've received, the most valuable piece wasn't the things I was necessarily most defensive about. It was revelations in things that were blind spots to me. I didn't know this easy adjustment or this extra thing I could say would mean so much to somebody. Because a lot of times in any seat you sit in, it's just my job. I just do my job and I make that money. At different organizations, it could be large sums of money. And you just think, well, that person doesn't come in like, I am a person that makes this. And most people just like, they're people that go to work and they have kids and their kids don't think they're that awesome. And like they get in their car or their standard car and they drive to work. Like we all do work stuff, right? And we get there, I think surveys can bubble up some of that stuff. Like, I had no idea that our value of compassion was not being realized through how I run my meetings or how I deal with my remote employees, or like, so that back to that point, if I have that core value of compassion, which we don't at ADVISA, believe it or not, maybe that'd be career ending for me. I don't know. I hope I'm compassionate, but now I know I'm tying it to something that I know matters to the whole organization if I'm the leader that's getting feedback. Because when you run these, if you've never run one before, you can get cuts that go down to every leader. As long as what is the amount? Is it at least 5?
Yeah, at least 5.
That's the standard.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about this, like, that's a good way to wake people up in a certain sense. Like, hey, this matters to your team. They're telling it to you through this channel that's very tangible. And by the way, here's who we committed to be. Like, that's such a huge lock-in point.
Yeah.
All right. Any other bad ideas? I got tons of bad ideas. Like,
I would add just 2 more things. And this is something we talk about with our clients on the front end. You have to have a really good communication strategy. To that point, why are we doing this? Why is this important? And then including all the forms of communication that your organization has. So you're having multiple touch points of why this is so valuable. You have to have a good rollout to get a good outcome with the survey. So if you don't have that, don't bother doing a survey. I'd say another thing is you also have to consider your population. If you are in a season of taxes, we're not going to try and do it around the tax deadline or your fiscal year end, open enrollment, when it's going to demand a lot of our people. We want to be mindful of what other competing priorities people have on their plates is going to be important.
I like that. It's almost like the great idea that can't be executed. Doing nothing's probably a better choice.
Yeah.
When you don't know how to, well, what else have you communicated out? When I'm in a sales process, I ask that question a lot. Oh, we're going to roll out this thing and it's going to change. Hey, what have you rolled out in the last couple of years? How'd that go? Oh, it was terrible. And this one failed to launch. And this one, I'm like, so walk me through how that's going to be different with this investment of time and energy, this ask of your employees, or, oh gosh, we're terrible at communicating. Maybe we should shore that up first about like, or use this as the exercise to reset the table. Yeah, that's huge. It's amazing how we were just in a meeting about this recently, about how assuming that you communicated.
Yeah.
And it's like, did you get that feedback from someone else? Or did you just decide based on whatever evidence you needed? Say, oh, I've clearly shared this with Sarah and she understands it how I understand it. And Sarah said that to you? Well, no, it's in this email, or it's in this note, or it's on Teams, or it's on Slack, or it's on... I'm always like, we got to inch up our standard here, or else the fact of the matter is maybe Sarah understands, maybe, but you don't know. That's something that probably should be cleaned up before saying, hey, we're going to do this gigantic project to get feedback from you and then do something with it. What's the credibility you would have with your workforce if you can't do that? Like, you don't even have it to build on. No, great catch.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we're only 14 minutes in and I used up my great point. Thanks for tuning in. All right.
We'll try to carry the team.
Let's go to the next one as per usual. So it's a little broader one. What are the top challenges that leaders have when rolling out a survey? I think we kind of dipped our toe in the water with what are the bad ideas. But I suppose when you think about doing something right and doing it well, it could be intimidating. It can be intimidating to do this. And obviously getting the feedback, it's like, hey, we're going to do a 360 on you, Dave. Okay. Who are my raters? And there's emotions in getting this feedback because there's an expectation with it. So I'd love to hear from you both on what do you feel are the top challenges?
I think a lot of what I witness is there's a natural tendency to be fearful of what's going to come up in the survey results and feeling like perhaps it's more than they can take on. But I think what we often find is there's really simple, tangible action items that they can walk away with that, to your point, we realize, folks have a very different definition of what something is. And if we can clarify that alleviates a lot of barriers for people to do their work. We often find maybe there's silos occurring. So there's a lot of great information that comes from the surveys itself. I'd say some of the challenges are, I think a lot of organizations put a lot of weight on the HR team to carry this initiative through, whereas it really needs to be embraced by all leaders at all levels of the organization. People have to opt into how can I help my own engagement throughout this process versus this is something the organization has to provide for me. There is a level of that, I do believe. So I think, the initiative putting a lot of weight on the HR team, and some other challenges are getting those actions to essentially have people follow through with taking action after the fact. Because sometimes you wrap up, you get the results, you're like, okay, great, we're done. How do we stay accountable to those action items and make sure we carry them out and that folks are holding on to what they said that they were going to do?
So the two things, number one, role clarity out of the gates, and the HR showing the backbone to say, hey, here's what we will do. Here's these empty seats to make sure this gets well so we get good data, and making sure that agreement is done in advance so there's no blame to distribute. There's accountability.
Yeah.
And the second piece is almost like the way that we could do this is show an empty template of potential actions before you even get the data. Hey, just so you know, this gives birth to this. So like as a manager, I might want to think about, I'm just not getting data and reacting to it. Yeah, no, we're going to take it and put it in strategic initiatives or action plans based upon the feedback that you have to put some thought into. That's another area of transparency, that it's not just, we're going to gather data. Great. Yeah. Team, take the thing. Like, this is coming, it's going to roost back home. So roles and the action.
Yeah.
Awesome. Sarah?
Yeah, a couple of things too. I was going to say, I feel like trust is maybe a big challenge right at the beginning. Is like, do your people trust the organization enough to even give that feedback? That can be a really big hurdle to overcome. And I feel like we see that specifically as kind of the surveys running through that participation rate. Are your people actually giving the feedback? Do they believe that, okay, I can give this honest, candid feedback and it's confidential and I'm not gonna be fired for what I say? Yeah. I think that's kind of a big hurdle that we work with leaders on, is how do we overcome that? How do we communicate that to your organization and to your people so that they can trust you enough to give that feedback? So I think that's kind of like the higher level. And then I would also say another challenge that I've seen with leaders like post-survey close is when we're reviewing the data, is it gets really easy to really get dialed in on specific numbers. And so that can almost be an emotional thing of like, ooh, that number's bad. Like I don't feel good about that. I don't know what to do about that. Or maybe even try to explain it away a little bit. But I would almost like challenge leaders to say, like, it's less about the number and more about what you do from reviewing that data. So it's like, okay, I'm uncomfortable that maybe this score is low. Can I have conversations with people within the organization to learn why these certain statements related to whatever outcome it is were rated lower than others? And so I think the challenge is for it to be a starting point to conversations.
No, I like that. And I think for leaders, you have to have a modicum of emotional intelligence when looking at this. You can't be too reactive. You can feel your feelings and look at it like, yeah, I wish that were different, but absorb it. Emotional responses as you're looking at these things are like, they're like flags, like our body does them. They're signals, like what you choose to do with them. Oh, I got a 2. Out of what? Out of 2,000, BJ. Oh, okay. Like, seek to understand. Okay, here's a potential blind spot. Like maybe it's 1 or 2 actions, get that to the 2,000. It's not this heavy lift that you think it is. A comment I have about, I'll have to test with you about like when you're rolling it out, when let's say you're in an environment that there is a lack of trust or there's a leadership change or something like that, and everyone's kind of on edge. There isn't trust, but we want to gather data. How do we do it? Some advice maybe I would give to a leadership team as your CEO, your president, whoever's at the top, is admit that as part of the rollout communication. Hey, we've done a lot to damage your trust in this organization, this leadership team, as exampled by blah, 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 blah. In an effort to hit reset, we'd love to get a baseline on how you're experiencing this culture, not how we assume you are. Onward. Like, I think that level of transparency, realizing like, where's this coming from? It's coming from, we've screwed up. It's coming from our turnover's too high. It's coming from our managers are burned out. It's coming from, and obviously we can do better, maybe collectively, but we're the leadership team. Like there's reasons why you shouldn't trust what comes out of here. And we'd love to do something about that. I'm thinking switch roles. If I got that note, yeah, you know what? I'll contribute to that. Now, granted, if you're in a company where even that isn't believable, you should probably get a new company to work for. I mean, really, right? I mean, that level of transparency, I'm like, what are they up to? And I'm like, come on. There's a lot of companies to work for. Sometimes I just want to go like, is the juice worth the squeeze here, on that team. So
Yeah.
any other challenges we can think of? I'm trying to think of work that we've done, challenges that leaders face. One I would add maybe is unwillingness of a leadership team to effectively own and then respond to the challenges because they're inconvenient, they're too big. They want to ignore them because they're not part of core strategy, which is a reason, but like you should say it instead of just ignoring it. Well, that's not what we do here. It's like, well, you should probably tell the people that work here that that's not going to be coming down the pipe. But also it's like, how frustrating would it be to be a leader? Hey, I want to address this, but I'm about to be under-resourced to do it. I literally know what to do. I have a plan to do it. You won't sponsor it if I'm even in HR. Or let's say I run customer service or client success, or I'm the foreman of a construction team in this remote location, and you wanted me to do something about it, but you won't. I can't. I'm pinned. I think those would also be big challenges. Well, what if we hear something, which could be a fear, that we literally can't address?
Yeah.
My answer to that would be like, aren't you glad you know though? I mean, versus let's just not talk about it. Anybody in a relationship where not talking about it is the move? And that turned out awesome, right? Like that just worked out great. That'll be a separate podcast we'll dive into. All right. I've done employee service, employee experience or engagement surveys. I understand them if I'm listening to this. What else is out there? Like other ways I want to get feedback that maybe isn't this heavy lift.
Yeah.
What might you consider if we just go around? I know we have a couple that we might bring up, but what else might I research or look into?
Yeah, I think something Sarah and I were talking about is just how you expand upon the employee experience. And something we do with some clients is you get these data points in the comments, but you want to know more. How can we move the needle? And so sometimes focus groups have been helpful, where we've come in and led those, sometimes having a third party be neutral and asking those questions, collecting that feedback, giving themes is helpful. That is a bit more of a lift, but this could also be done internally. Just having conversations, you'd be amazed how much feedback people are willing to give, and just the communication, the presence of leadership coming around. Hey, what's going on in your world? What are some of the barriers for you to get your work done? I think that can go a long way in just building that culture and getting active pulses on how people are feeling. Some companies even do maybe a quarterly focus group from certain leaders from different departments to really break down those silos. So, I mean, that's kind of another way to get firsthand feedback from people, aside from other assessments that we could talk about as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, some organizations also utilize pulse surveys around specific topics like DEI or compensation and benefits, just to get feedback based on certain topics that you want to learn about. So maybe there is a change in your organization and you would just want to do a pulse survey of 2 questions or just something quick, those quick hits to get feedback on more specific items. I would say a caution with those is to make sure that you're not instilling survey fatigue in your employees. So making sure that those are spaced out enough of so they're not feeling, another survey is hitting my inbox and I have to take another 10 minutes to give this feedback. Just be careful with it, but that feedback can be helpful on those more specifics.
I like it. So Sarah's point is that you have pulse surveys smaller, tighter. Krista's, you have a couple layers in there. One is, what do you do with the comments, like diving into some focus groups, but also like senior leadership presence in different places. Like how well are we distributing that? So we have a truer understanding of what our frontline workers are experiencing.
Absolutely. Because I think often what we find in the data point is there's such a disconnect between that senior leadership team and those who are doing the work day in and day out. And so how can we close that gap between the two?
Right. I like it. I'm trying to think of other alternatives to a full employee survey, but I think that's those buckets. If you riff off of even what Sarah and Krista shared, I mean, it's like, what's the point of this exercise? It's getting real information on people's experience of working here. That could even happen at the manager level.
Yeah.
In other places, like you can figure out how to slice this to be the least amount of burden for the employees of an organization. And I don't know, I'm like, well, our employees aren't that busy, so they'll have time for this. I've never heard that. Not once. No one's ever showed me we have plenty of time for this. We can get this done in a week. Oh, cool. Like I've never met a company like this before. So it's employee. Let's just assume people are doing plenty of work.
Yeah.
There's plenty going on. How might you lighten that lift? All right. So Krista, put you on the spot here to dive in. What patterns, and Krista could tell some stories about how she knows this, where she's been recently, but patterns some global data on employee engagement. So if I'm listening to this, like what are some things like on shorthand that would be good for me to know as I'm trying to maybe spearhead something like this or maybe bring it to a leadership team?
Sure. Studies recently show roughly 21% of people globally are actively engaged at work. That means a lot of people are disengaged at work. We have been through a lot as a culture, as global workforce. Work is changing. And the reality is we need to prepare for that change of work and think about what is the future of work. There's a lot of, layover from the pandemic and folks who have been on the front line this entire time. So we're seeing a lot of burnout, a lot of stress, a lot of loneliness. That was a big thing. I recently went to SIOP, which is Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology's annual conference. And a lot of the themes that I took away was about this great reconnection. People are feeling super lonely in their roles, whether that's I work remote now all the time. I feel disconnected from my team, my organization. I think about work in a different way. I don't want it to have as much a priority in my life, and finding that healthy work-life balance for folks. So there's a lot going on. And I think we're also demanding, or managers are being required to step up in a lot of different ways. And so are we giving them the adequate tools to support these folks? Mm-hmm. I think what stood out to me was recently from a DDI report is that the majority of managers don't know how to recognize the signs of burnout. So if you can't recognize the signs, how can you coach through that? There were a lot of great takeaways and nuggets from that, but I think connection with people and then meaning and purpose is going to be huge in the future of work.
Nice. Well, and that's, to Sarah's point earlier, that could be a pulse survey right there, just grabbing those highlights of how if 21% are engaged, that means the balance. If you think about that, your workplace probably, if it's a decent amount of size, 100 people, it's probably not much different. In a lot of cases, that's probably a safer assumption. So vetting for that. Is there loneliness? Is there burnout? Can you perceive burnout? How do you know those things? And then that can inform training investments for creating a level of awareness so that we can address these things that the globe has to deal with.
Yeah.
Anything else of note in your travels, Krista?
Yeah. Thinking about some other trends that came up while I was there. Some interesting topics around AI. So how that's going to change the future of work. I think it's going to be really interesting. It's probably going to be a lot of scrutiny around regulation, legislature, how those algorithms are formed. So it'll be really interesting to see where that comes in terms of the future of work. Trying to think of some additional things that came up. Just this idea of culture, where culture is created, whether you're intentional about it or not, and how can you be more intentional? So that was really fascinating to hear about.
Well, and I think culture, when we talk about culture, I kind of geek out about this a little bit because I'm a sports fan. And if you look at certain sports teams and what have you, it's like you can see where they made a culture choice by not making any at all. I got a bunch of superstars, or I got one superstar, and it's like this imbalance of influence, and there's not a clear narrative going on, and there's not clear roles. And then the fan base is frustrated because it's like, how are we not winning? We spent all this money, and like, if you're a leader listening to this, have you ever felt that way about your team? How are we not, I hired you, I know you could, why aren't you doing this? To Krista's point, have you been intentional about the environment upon which they work? Have you created, we're on our walk downtown here where I live, it's have you created containers for where work goes? And is it sensical? Does it line up with the type of work? Does it line up with your people? I think we're going to go full remote. I think we're going to go hybrid. Are you making a spreadsheet decision? Or did you get feedback that resonates? I can do better work here, here, or here.
Yeah.
And that's a good listening exercise to say, hey, what should our culture be? Yes, as if you're the senior leader, a lot of that's going to come from you because you have to carry it. However, including everyone else in how that's made is only going to increase the thumbprint of people. It said, hey, I am able to do, and it is important to me because. These can be things like PTO, When do I get trained? Can I work from home? Childcare, medical services, like dog watching. Like people, like we just heard this one somewhere where one of the benefits was dog sitting.
Oh, wow.
And it was like a huge perk and people loved it. And I just felt bad that I was remote during COVID and I have my pets and I just love them and I loved working around them and now I have to come back in the office and I can't. They offered that and it was a huge benefit. And if I'm a leader that doesn't have an animal, I might never have thought that that's part of a culture that would be meaningful to a person to make them feel like, hey, you matter enough to me that we want to pull on this extra expense so that you can work being less burdened. Like, and those could be, and don't trust us, like listen to your people, right? Like you were just giving you questions.
Yeah.
Any other patterns or things from the global data that would be important to share?
Yeah, I think we see this a lot with our engagement work where there's a lot of different generations in the workforce currently. And so that's a very common data slice that we dive into when we're doing engagement surveys. And it's really interesting because the leaders are of a certain generation and the folks that are really coming out of college and into the workforce are a different generation. And we all show up in the time frames that we were born with very different needs. And we're going to work to get those needs met because we're human and we have needs. And so even if we're at work, those needs don't go away. The struggle, I think, is each generation is trying to understand, well, this is my need. Why isn't that your need? What is it that you need out of work? And I think it's just finding that helpful balance of how we can meet one another where we're at, because we share so much in our sessions that by 2030, most of the baby boomers will be out of the workforce. And the majority of those taking over will be millennials and Gen Z. And thinking through that, if they're the folks that are the most disengaged, what sort of actions are you going to be taking around this data? What's important to them? So I think it's really easy to maybe rip on the younger generations, but the reality is they're going to be making up the majority of it. And how can we meet those work needs? What are different? Right. What can we look into? And so purpose and meaning are that much more important to the younger generations.
2 comments to calm everybody down that's listening. One is like, it was said that once books came out, people were worried that it would weaken the mind because you didn't have to remember anything. And then once radio came out, they worried that it was going to distract them from books because that's where the real knowledge was. And then once TV came out, we're not going to be together as a family and listen to the radio and et cetera, et cetera. And then that rock and roll music, what a fad. That rap music, what a fad. Yeah. It's like, I think that as those come up, like things norm downstream. So I think that there's a certain sense that some of it will take care of itself. And as I hate to say this, but as an organism, as time passes, the older and older generations, we will become less and less relevant because there will be less and less of us. And that's true for both of you too, over time. Like that's what's going to happen because the employee body is going to be folks of the age of their early 20s to like, upper 50s. And like, those ages don't change. Like that's the working ages and they're going to keep coming through and bringing their norms with them. So it's like, those kids. And I always thought it was a great idea. Like the kids are texting at work too much. They always call them when I'm dealing with older leaders and they're over their fidgets. Kids are always texting to work. They're always on their phones. And I just, a great idea one of my clients came up with was he actually got rid of their phones and he gave them new phones and they were rotary cell phones. And it was completely cured the texting problem. I just made that up, but I thought it was really funny. I love that you tried to stay with me. Like he's being serious. He's totally being serious.
You wouldn't lie on a podcast.
I would totally lie just to make people laugh. That's the only time I lie.
Well,
trust me. Trust me. It's the only time I lie. Or when I deliver an engagement survey, then I'm lying when I'm doing that. So no, I just think that the theme though on that is like that stuff's true. And but when you look at that distribution, like what jobs does that distribution have? And you have to also look at the power dynamics of that distribution because a lot of the power is going to be in the older generations. Yeah. And by the way, time will also take care of that. There's things like, all right, there is still some earning it. There is still some, not earning it in terms of I've lived this long in the company, but there's certain level of institutional knowledge people gather that sometimes isn't as respected. They're there holding up all the other leaders. How might we change how those senior leaders work? Which, heaven forbid we change a COO's title. Heaven forbid that like we can distribute that job a little different to add a younger leader in while maintaining this major knowledge center and make sure everybody has a seat at the table. There are creative ways to do this, but sometimes we can get stuck. That's just the way it is. And you need a COO and you need, I'm like, why not have 3? We don't have that much money. I'm like, well, like, I think there's some people here that would love to give some discretionary effort to come to that meeting, to be over here, to like take a part of that job and start learning it under the auspices of that leader over the next 5 years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's not this wholesale and then include everybody in it. I think there's creative ways to do it. And I was meeting with the leader of a hospital that was looking at their senior leadership team in terms of all kinds of levels of diversity of age, like diversity of gender, diversity of this, and was very intentional, all while maintaining a standard of performance for the job. And they shared with me how challenging that was. Like, you have to be more intentional. You have to search longer. You have to be intentional about development. You have to do all these things. And people might say, like, I shouldn't have to do that. All right, put your head in your pillow with that. I shouldn't. That's also it's like another one of my favorite words, which is deserve. Ugh. I deserve okay, is it the parking spot? Is it the office? Is it the paycheck? Is it I'm like, I don't know, nothing ever great ever came after that. So, all right, cool. Thank you, Krista, for sharing some of those.
Yeah.
All right. Last one we can riff on. As you listening know, I own a fitness and sports performance and CrossFit facility. I care a great deal about wellness and about fitness. And so does our certified yoga instructor over here as well. And that's something that Sarah does a lot for us within ADVISA. So engagement, if you're engaging the whole person, like, that is a function of engaging them, that you need well people to come to work, to do work, to maintain energy, to maintain optimism, to like come in a place prepared to communicate and do their job. So I just love to hear your perspective, Sarah, on where does wellness fit into this whole picture as we're looking at employee engagement?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that we can have this conversation without it being a part of the picture personally. I think it's embedded and threaded within the picture versus fitting it in like a puzzle piece. And I think you brought it up perfectly when you said it's the whole person. And so kind of the shift I feel like organizations are making post-pandemic is we've blurred the lines between life and work, with remote work and with just wanting to care about people throughout this weird thing that we've all experienced together that most people in their lifetimes don't experience, a giant pandemic. So it's really the idea that now that we've blurred those lines between work and life, people are bringing their whole selves to work. And so it's our jobs to care about that and care about that person as they show up. And we really follow a model at ADVISA of the wellness wheel, which boils down wellness into 8 different aspects of physical wellness, emotional, occupational, financial. Like, there's all of these different sectors that we should be caring about and we should be focusing on within our workplaces to make sure that, yes, people can actually show up to work. And it's been shown that with the focus on wellness, we can lower absenteeism, increase engagement. So again, it's part of the conversation of how we get our employees to show up and do great work. Like, yes, we want that for the bottom line, but it's also about caring about people as individuals and wanting to see people thrive and flourish within their roles and within their organizations.
When I take it back to something you said earlier about it rises and falls with the leadership team. If you have unfit or unwell leaders, it's going to be hard to have a robust wellness practice within your business versus, and we've talked as we're walking throughout the day about something I shared, presence equals priority. If there's a walking program, is your senior leadership team out there walking? Are you leading the way in this practice? And if you're not, it's going to be a sub HR function that gets kind of lip service and doesn't have the teeth that you want it to have. And like putting that leadership voice behind it. And I think if you're a leader listening to this and you are not relationship well, inside and outside of work, financially well, and that's just not like how much money is in your bank account, but the decisions you're making, the emotional content of your financial decisions, physically well, emotionally well, mentally well. If you're not doing all that, how prepared are you for the task? You know, and it's not to say like everyone should have 6-pack abs and have $50 million in the bank. Like, that's not the point of all this. But the point is effort, like toward that. And am I a credible leader? when I'm rolling this out? I'm sure there's some organizations that would say like, I got a few people on our leadership team that like don't demonstrate that in any one of those different categories. Much like engagement work, it's going to be tough to have a really seamless rollout versus organizations that I work with. I have some that are in the world of cycling that I work with, where everyone has bikes on their wall and everyone rides, and like they have like, it's embedded, like wellness is what their culture is. Like it's a little easier in an environment like that versus a bank. What's the job? Sitting here looking at that, driving to a lunch, like a more traditional, maybe old school style of work might be a little more challenging to build one of those practices, is because we're a meeting culture. From this time of day to that time of day, where does all this nest within our priorities? So it's, I don't know, if you're listening to this and you're a student or you're looking for a new employment, you're like, wellness is important to me. You could pick a sector where it is all about wellness, or whatever the product or services makes wellness like just a function of working there. But in other areas, it's like, how do you engage a leadership team in something that like they can get behind to roll something out?
Yeah. I think too, it's important to keep in mind that wellness is going to be individual for every single person. What balance and wellness looks like to you and looks like to me is going to be different than what it looks like to BJ and what it looks like to Krista. And so I think as you're thinking about like rolling something out, or we think about the different environments that it might exist in, is that it's going to look different for the individual. So I think it's even more important for the leader then to be in tune with their team members, and also modeling those behaviors like you talked about. Is you help create that culture when you model behaviors of wellness, of taking time off or taking 10 minutes out of your day to walk outside and smell the fresh air, things like that. That can mean wellness to you. But just modeling those things for your team, I think, is really important. So then they feel empowered to model what wellness means to them. But it's kind of up to the leader to create the environment for that first. So I think piece one is just creating that environment through leadership. And piece two is what structures are in place within our organizations that either hinder or help encourage wellness. So do you have an employee assistance program? Do you have good benefits for mental health? Do you have even just somewhere on site where employees can take 10 minutes to take a break? So I think it's really about that environment piece, and also structures that you can create. So yeah.
Like it. And another idea, going back to other things you can assess outside of a employee engagement survey, maybe taking that wellness wheel and turning it into an individual that you can get a collective. To your point, everyone's individual. It might be different. How different from the leadership team is different employee bases as it relates to wellness. Like, are we getting that data, and where are the gaps? And if we like, hey, maybe we should bring somebody to talk about finances. Like you can do that. Like you can get that information and figure out like, hey, is there a gap there, and is it important to people?
Yeah.
Krista?
Yeah. I think what Sarah touched on that we often talk about is just the shadow of the leader. And what kind of shadow is that leader creating? Because it's there regardless. We often hear a leader say, I send emails at night, or I work late, but I don't expect my people to do that. Well, they're observing what you're doing. And the reality is people look to those who have made it, or who are in leadership positions, to know that's what I have to do. That's what's expected.
Right.
So even though you can say as much as you want, I don't expect you to do that, they're watching your behavior and what you do. And so I think an easy way is, again, are people taking time off? Are you encouraging your people and making sure, hey, when are you taking that next vacation? Are you using your PTO? Even though we have unlimited PTO, I want to make sure you're using it. Things like that, the reinforcement, they have to see that, hey, you're doing this. That's okay. It's okay to take a break. Whereas a lot of the years of working, people have been rewarded for not taking time off. And so really reframing that mindset of how can we embrace that wellness?
That's terrific. It's a great point to end on. And if listening today to both Sarah, Krista, and myself, if you have questions about any of these things and say, hey, I'd love to dive into how that might work at my organization, by all means, like click the links on our site. If you're at advisausa.com/leadership talks, there's a variety of ways to sync up with us, connect with us if you want to talk with us in general. Otherwise, if you go back through here, feel free to share something like this with your leadership team if you're considering doing something like this and think about these pockets. And we have a variety of ways to help clients digest, like, what is the right timing? When is the bad timing? Like, why would we do this? How does this fit in to an overall picture? So Sarah, Krista, thanks for spending time with us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
All right. Till next time, everybody.